So now I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Avi Patt, and you all have a detailed bio of him, so I'm not going to read it now, but I just wanted to say, first of all, to thank Professor Patt for joining us today. He's been really a wonderful resource for us at the museum, in the education department, and the other departments, a great speaker and scholar of Jewish history and history of the Holocaust and post-war Jewish history. And I'm delighted that Professor Patt is joining us today. So without further ado, I hand you Professor Patt, who will be talking about Avraham Klausner and the Sheres Hapletah, the survivor list project.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, Liz, and it's nice to see everyone here. I just want to make sure everybody can hear me and see me, and we're good. Great. So in a moment, I'm going to share my PowerPoint so everyone can see that. It's always nice to participate in these seminars, and it's wonderful to follow such a wonderful speaker, Natalia Alexiou. And it's a whole other family reunification project that we can talk about at another point in time, a distant cousin. So you never know when these family reunifications may happen, but that's a whole other story. So thank you for organizing this workshop, and it's nice to see everyone, even if we can't meet together in person. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint, so I'll make sure that that works. Okay, you should be able to see this. Great. Okay, so you'll see that I will be talking about Rabbi Abraham Klausner, but I also thought it would only be appropriate to bring in one of his important partners in the project that I'll be discussing today, and that's Dr. Zalman Grinberg, and I'll explain a little bit more about why it's so important. And you can see here in the cover slide, this is an image of Rabbi Abe Klausner, who was an American Jewish chaplain, who I'll tell you all the biographical details you need to know, but you're looking at the cover image. You can see him in uniform, right in the middle of this photo, pictured together with survivors not long after liberation. I believe this photo was taken in Munich. So this project and the topic of today's workshop is an incredibly important and poignant topic, and I'm happy to be able to offer some details specifically on one names list project, one effort to reunite families after the war, the Sheres Hapletah names list project. But I also, as I mentioned, want to speak more on the relationship between Abe Klausner and Zalman Grinberg, who worked together to develop the Central Committee of Liberated Jews, something that I've written about elsewhere and in an article on Abe Klausner if you're interested in all the details on this topic. And more generally, beyond this names list project, I think part of the story that needs to be told is the central role that these two figures played in developing a unified voice for what would come to be known as the Sheres Hapletah, the surviving remnant, that collective definition of the surviving Jewish population that came particularly to congregate in the American zone of occupied Germany, but more on that later, as well as this names list project that I'm going to talk about, the very specific listing of names that was also called the Sheres Hapletah. Grinberg and Klausner would help to create this unified voice, a voice that expressed a unanimous Zionist conclusion for the survivors, which, as I've argued elsewhere, played no small part in diplomatic decisions that would ultimately lead to the creation of the State of Israel. So while I propose to speak today about Klausner and the Names List project, I also want to speak on this unique personal relationship that developed between Klausner and Grinberg in the year that they worked together after liberation, one where they managed to establish a deeply personal and tight bond that would impact each of them for the rest of their lives. And I think this is something that we as historians often miss as we sift through documents and even photos, but I think forms a crucial backstory to this period, one in which Jewish displaced persons who felt alone and abandoned by the world resolved to help themselves and develop a vocal and independent streak that manifested itself in a strong embrace of Zionism as the only solution to their stateless condition. And yet, in this period immediately after liberation, there were certain Jews from the outside world, like Abe Klausner, who proved their dedication to the surviving remnant and came to be accepted as what Klausner was referred to as an honorary displaced person. And I put that in quotation marks. The survivors themselves saw Klausner as their most trusted advocate, referring to him as, quote, our chaplain, and unlike any other Jew from the outside world, as, quote, one of us. As he worked tirelessly for the liberated, his zealous Zionist advocacy helped to link the DP problem to the political situation in Palestine. Yet, as I may mention by the end of my remarks today, by 1948, his own Zionist passion seemed to outpace that of most survivors. In some ways, it seems that Klausner played a prominent role as both a, quote, outsider from the outside world and an insider who could speak for the survivors in a certain way and help them develop the ability to advocate for themselves before military authorities and world Jewry. His identification with the original 20,000 or so survivors who formed the core of the Sherit Hapletah in 1945 would shift into a growing disillusionment with the nature of the changed and expanded population that came to inhabit the American zone by 1947. And I know Tina Grossman later in the workshop will be talking about some of the changes that shaped what we would come to define as the surviving population, the Sherit Hapletah, this question of how people and where they had survived. What was it that Jews like Klausner from the outside world understood about the survivors that it would take Jews, the rest of the Jewish world, decades to understand? So now let me just show you. So this is Abe Klausner, not long after liberation. Here's a picture of Zalman Grinberg, who I'll come back to and tell you a little bit more about how the two of them came to meet immediately after the liberation of Dachau and Kaufering specifically. So now Klausner. Klausner was born in Memphis, Tennessee, April 27th, 1915, and he was one of 5 children of Joseph Klausner, an immigrant from Hungary, and Tilly Binstock Klausner, an immigrant from Austria. He graduated from the University of Denver in 1938 and was ordained at the Hebrew Union College in 1941. Following his ordination, he joined the army and served as a chaplain. He entered the Dachau concentration camp with the 116th Evacuation Hospital in mid-May 1945. Okay, you can see here on this map the sort of timing of the liberation of the different camps. And when he entered Dachau in mid-May 1945, this was about 3 weeks after the camp had been liberated. And he would end up remaining in that area of Germany, in Munich in particular, for approximately the next year. Upon his arrival in Dachau, Klausner helped survivors to bury the dead and to organize bedding and provisions, including kosher food. He was deeply moved by survivors' constant requests for information about family members and for aid in finding them. In a testimony recorded in 1998, Klausner recalled one of his first encounters at Dachau, and here I'll quote from the testimony. "And then a thing happened which changed the course of my life. A voice came down from one of the shelves, and it was very thin, and it had a cry. And the voice said, 'I had a brother, and we lived together, and he went to the United States and became a rabbi. Do you know my brother?' And strangely enough," Klausner recalls, "I said yes. Not only do I know your brother, but he is here in Europe, and I will bring him to you. I realized I now had a purpose." Klausner went on to detail that after reuniting this Dachau inmate with his brother, an American Jewish chaplain by the name of Abraham Spiro, Klausner quickly resolved to find and bring brothers together. As he later wrote in his memoir, which was called A Letter to My Children, "The moment penetrated my soul, telling me I had a purpose in coming to Dachau. If I brought brothers together and nothing more, I would have achieved some small measure of significance in my life." Klausner began to compile lists of survivors he met in the camps he surveyed in Bavaria and published them under the series title She'erit Hapletah, or you can see here as it's spelled out, She'erit Hapletah, or in the Yiddish pronunciation, Sheres Hapletah. As he later recalled in his memoir, I thought back to my seminary days and my love affair with the prophets, who agonized over the behavior of their people and prophesied ruin for their corruption, but never allowed them to be fully destroyed. There would always be a She'erit Hapletah, a surviving remnant, to treasure the call of the Lord. I scribbled the title on the batch of lists I left with the printer, She'erit Hapletah. And this is, you can see, the 4th volume of this list of names that would be published. Now, while the term She'erit Hapletah, the surviving remnant, was used as early as 1943 by Yishuv leaders to refer to the remnant of European Jewry who would survive the war, it is still noteworthy that Klausner chose this formulation as the title for the list of survivors he had compiled. And indeed, there's some debate as to where this name would come from for this collective identification and definition of the surviving remnant, this term that would be used to refer to the surviving population in Europe, the She'erit Hapletah, the surviving remnant. In the first volume that was published of the She'erit Hapletah, Klausner included a preface to the volume titled, quote, "Regarding Your Rights," unquote. In this piece, he informed survivors that contrary to official UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration policy of the time, they were not obligated to return to their former countries. They were free to make their own decisions about whether to repatriate. And this is a very important point because at the very beginning, as Klausner was responding to the immediate need, and one of the things Natalia talked about, this question about who has survived, where are people, how will I find them, and creating lists of names, he also uses this publication as a vehicle to inform survivors about the political dynamics of what's happening, about what their rights are, about where they, as stateless displaced persons, fall in this general category of people who are being organized according to their country of origin. Polish DPs, Ukrainian DPs, Lithuanian DPs, Jewish DPs were not the same as non-Jewish DPs from those countries, but in this early period, they would have been lumped into those categories. After the 116th Evacuation Hospital was sent to a different location, Klausner returned to Dachau against Army orders, telling the commander of the 127th Evacuation Unit at Dachau that he had been reassigned. Eventually, after the 127th left Dachau, Klausner was assigned to a G5 Civil Affairs staff section to work in the interests of the displaced persons. Beyond aiding survivors in their search for lost relatives and pressing American Jewish organizations for aid, Klausner sought early on to convey to the Yishuv the political wishes of the survivors. In the 3rd issue of She'erit Hapletah, he published a letter from the Jewish Agency to the surviving population that stated, quote, "The only wish of the Yishuv is to see gathered in our land the remnant of the house of Israel," unquote. And there's a whole story also about where he printed. He obtained the materials to print this first volume of the She'erit Hapletah, the first names list, not far from Kaufering, where the camp, I'll talk about Grinberg in a moment, one of the satellite camps of Dachau was the town of Landsberg, which is where one of the largest Jewish DP camps would come to be located. Landsberg is also the place where Hitler was imprisoned after the failed Munich beer hall putsch in November of 1923. And it's also the place where Mein Kampf was published in Landsberg. And I don't know if this is true, but Klausner said that he used the same printer that published Mein Kampf to publish the names list that he would begin to assemble of people who had survived. So you can think about the symbolic meaning of that. Now, for survivors themselves, the turn to Zionism for most of the survivors remaining in Germany was indeed immediate. And in fact, for many of them, it dated to the pre-war or wartime period. Together with other chaplains and scattered soldiers who had arrived or passed through Germany with the Jewish Brigade, a Jewish unit stationed with the British Army after the war, Klausner played an important role in communicating this demand to the outside world, especially at a time when the Yishuv was still uncertain as to whether the DPs could aid them in the struggle to create the state. Now, during the course of his early work in Bavaria, Klausner met, and here he is, met Zalman Grinberg, a doctor and a survivor from Kovno, who would become a close friend and colleague in the rebuilding of Jewish life in post-war Germany. Shortly before liberation, with the knowledge that American forces were nearby, Grinberg took control of the military hospital at the monastery in St. Ottilien. With the arrival of American troops the following day, Grinberg was appointed director of the hospital, and some 400 Jews soon found refuge in the monastery. Most of the Jews there, former inmates of Dachau, had been removed from the camp by the Nazis just before it was liberated. Subsequently, they were freed by the United States Army in the village not far away of Schwabenhausen. Captain Otto Raymond, one of the first American officers to arrive in the village, immediately placed Dr. Zalman Grinberg, the young physician from Kovno, in charge of the hospital. Grinberg had been among the Jewish survivors liberated at Schwabenhausen, and together with Captain Raymond, he had the wounded among the survivors driven by ambulance to St. Ottilien. Klausner then proceeded to have the Hungarian and Jewish soldiers moved out so that St. Ottilien became a DP hospital strictly for Jewish survivors. On May 27, 1945, a few weeks after the end of the war in Europe, just about 3 weeks after VE Day, the surviving remnant of the Kovno Ghetto Orchestra performed a liberation concert there, following a speech by Grinberg and the recitation of the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. As Alexander Grobnin has written about in his book on Jewish chaplains, after organizing the hospital at St. Ottilien with the assistance of Captain Raymond, Klausner soon located a second hospital, Gauting, a tuberculosis sanatorium southwest of Munich, and informed the German in charge that he was taking over. Grinberg came down from St. Ottilien to help organize the hospital and see that it was staffed with competent Jewish physicians. Until the latter arrived, however, the German physicians were retained. Klausner tried to set up other medical centers for Jews during this period, but the obstacles proved too great. Eventually, though, he did manage to establish a third Jewish hospital. And Atina Grossman, who will be speaking, I think, tomorrow, has written a lot about these interactions between Jews and Germans in the immediate aftermath of the war. When we watch later today, Langes der Weg, you're going to see this also. I won't give away plot points, but some of the interactions between Jews and Germans and Jews recuperating in hospitals in post-war Germany. Now, while demonstrating striking resourcefulness in the wake of tragedy, the survivors in the Munich region, Dachau, Landsberg, St. Ottilien, and the surrounding area, were also disenchanted with the Jewish relief organizations. Their slow arrival gave rise to a sense of abandonment that would remain a central feature of the surviving remnant's constant striving for independence. Grinberg himself expressed this disappointment in a letter to the World Jewish Congress at the end of May 1945, as he wrote, quote, "It has been 4 weeks since our liberation, and no representative of the Jewish world, no representative from any Jewish organization has come to be with us after the worst tragedy of all time, to speak with us, to give us help, and to lighten our burden. We must ourselves, with our own diminished strength, help ourselves." And so you get this sense, you have all of the competing demands that are happening at the same time, trying to help the sick, trying to create lists of those who have survived, trying to bury the dead, trying to organize prayer services, trying to deal with the political needs that are emerging almost immediately after. All of this is happening in the aftermath of the war. Indeed, and here you can see some pictures of survivors in St. Ottilien not long after liberation. These are members, again, more pictures of people from St. Ottilien and the Kovno Ghetto Orchestra. So in his speech that I mentioned before on May 27, 1945, Grinberg addressed a crowd of 1,700 Jews who had gathered near Dachau. And as he wrote, "We have met here to celebrate our liberation, but at the same time we are mourning. For every bright and joyful day at present and in the future is shadowed by the tragic events of the years gone by. 1% survived to see the liberation, and 99% out of this 1% are very ill. Do you enjoy it? Are you able to celebrate?" As he noted, and I'll skip down, "We are free now, but we do not know with what to begin with our free but unhappy life. It seems to us that for the time being, mankind does not comprehend what we have gone through and what we have experienced during this period of time. And it seems to us, neither shall we be understood in the future. We unlearn to laugh. We cannot cry anymore. We do not comprehend our freedom yet because we are still among our dead comrades. Let us rise and stand silent to commemorate our dead. Discouraged by the continuing absence of assistance from world Jewry, Grinberg and Klausner decided to take matters into their own hands. And assisted by other survivors and representatives from the Jewish Brigade, Grinberg and Klausner convened the first meeting of the Central Committee of Liberated Jews in the US zone of Germany on July 1st, 1945, at the Feldafing Displaced Persons Camp near Dachau. The Central Committee's mission was to champion the interests of Jewish DPs and to draw attention of the US Army and UNRWA to their plight. And here you can see on this map, this is a map of partitioned Germany, which was partitioned into 4 zones of occupation. Most of what would become the Jewish DP camps, which were created after Earl Harrison's visit to post-war Germany in the summer of 1945, which I'll mention in a moment, most of the Jewish DP camps, importantly, were located in the American zone of occupation, although you can see Bergen-Belsen, for example, was a very large DP camp in the British zone of occupation. In September of 1946, the Central Committee of Liberated Jews gained official US Army recognition as the legal and democratic representation of the liberated Jews in the American zone. And the political organization of the surviving remnant, the Hapletah, and the priorities of its largely Zionist leadership would greatly influence the options available to the Jewish DP population as a whole. The Central Committee focused on the immediate needs of survivors for food, shelter, medicine, and security, and of course this question of identifying and locating family displaced by the war. But it also addressed larger questions of whether to encourage return to Poland and other European homelands or immigration to mandatory Palestine. And as one representative from Lithuania suggested, the lack of involvement on the part of world Jewry indicated that, quote, Aliyah was the only way to solve the Jewish question. That is, immigration to Palestine was the only collective solution to the problem of Jewish displacement. In its resolutions, the committee called for unity among the Jews in the effort to build the Jewish state and demanded that the British open the gates of Palestine. Abe Klausner was appointed honorary president of the Central Committee, and Dr. Grinberg was elected chairman of the executive board. Klausner later noted that he would identify that July 1st, 1945 meeting as a step toward creating this unified identity for survivors who had until then been locked away in various camps, denied identity, immobilized physically, socially, and culturally. And at subsequent meetings of the Central Committee, he reminded survivors that in the absence of outside assistance, we must help ourselves. And here you can see this official definition of what was a displaced person, and we can think about how Jews would have to try to find a place to advocate for themselves among this category that defined people outside of the national boundaries of their country, right? Where do you put stateless people who have no country to return to, have no ability to return to their homes? Klausner and the newly formed Displaced Persons leadership worked to ameliorate conditions in the DP camps. There were 6,000 Jews in Feldafing and 4,000 in Landsberg. Those were the largest DP camps in the American zone at the time, and also prevent Jewish displaced persons from being housed with non-Jewish former collaborators. And indeed, as I mentioned, these reports, some of which were responses to letter writing campaigns organized by Abe Klausner himself, reports of the poor conditions that Jewish DPs were being faced to confront, eventually prompted President Truman to send Earl Harrison as an envoy to the occupied Germany to see what could be done to improve conditions for the surviving population. You can see a photo of Harrison in the British zone visiting Bergen-Belsen, and this is ultimately his report, the Harrison report, that detailed the conditions of the surviving population that displaced Jews were forced to confront, and his recommendations, first of all, to establish a separate camp separate camps, separate Jewish displaced persons camps, to create an advisor for Jewish affairs, to advocate for the Jewish DPs, and to advocate for speedy migration to Palestine, which Harrison recommended as well. Now, in the midst of all of this organizational and diplomatic work, Klausner continued to focus on his original goal, which was publishing lists of names in the Shoah Hapletah, and most importantly, bringing families back together. In a testimony that was recorded at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 1995, Klausner described this tracing program that he had initiated. And here I'll read to you this quote, which sort of describes how this worked for survivors after the war. Besides the books that were published, and there were multiple volumes of this were published, I think 6 volumes were published by the beginning of 1946 that had over 60,000 names of surviving Jews listed in them. As he mentioned, besides the books that were published, we had a center in Munich at the Deutsches Museum, first where people came from all over Europe and came asking about their family, right? And we're going to see this in Langes del Weg also. Knowing the last location of where someone had been, traveling to that place. I mean, think about the weeks and months and indeed years that it would take for families to be reunited, to travel across the continent, to track down one piece of information to find where someone had been, only to find that they had moved on to another place in the meantime. So as he mentioned, what they would do at this museum, we put a table out in the lobby. People would come and tear pages out of the book, this book, where they would stack the lists of names, and we would have to feed the table with books, and then we would nail the pages down so that they would last a little bit longer. But if a person came and found no name in the book, they would go over to the wall. And it was a very large wall, and they would write a note on the wall saying, for example, "I was here," addressing it to a parent or to a child. "I've been looking for you, and I'll be going here or going there." So there would be some point at which they might be able to connect, right? And this is what people had to do in order to provide traces, scraps of information, a paper trail, so that if you were looking for someone, you might be able to find that person. This is where I was, this is where I'm going, come look for me here, right? In the hope that somebody might come across it and find you. As Klausner described one episode from the summer of 1945 in his memoir, and I'm going to read to you at length of this episode to get a sense for the poignancy of how this worked. During our last days in the museum, a stranger walked into my cubicle, carrying a child whom he placed upon my desk. I stared at the child and his bearer, each a vision etched in the contrast of youth and age. The stranger did not speak. He drew a paper from his pocket, which I recognize as a page from one of the Shoah Hapletah volumes. He unfolded the page, and he drew my attention to a line which read, "Grinberg, Zalman, Dr. Kaunas, 1912," at the same time pointing to the child, indicating that it was Zalman's. I was overwhelmed. This is Klausner speaking. It was the first child to arrive in our liberation zone. I took the child in my hands, stared, and spoke, saying things not for him to hear, but for me to say, caught up in a moment that made all others wither away. It was as if everything I had done had been a prelude to that moment. I don't know how long I started talking to the child, but when I turned to the stranger, he was gone. Frightened that I had lost him, I raced out of the room, through the hall, the lobby, down the stairs, into the courtyard, looking for him. Gone. And I did not say a word to him. I had been looking for him all these years, Klausner later recalled, wanting to tell them that about his goodness beyond all the hurt and pain we endure. When the word got out that a child had been brought to me from Lithuania, my cubicle was crowned with a curious, threatening to break apart its precarious walls. With the arrival of Yankel Levin, pandemonium broke loose. And here Yankel Levin called out, "That's my Emmanuel," he cried and half laughed. I took him out of the ghetto. He turned to talk to the child as if he would remember his escape from the ghetto, and then turned to me unfolding the story. And this is the story of how Zalman Grinberg's child survived in the ghetto. I took him out in the drawer of a credenza requisitioned by a Nazi officer. The child was born in the ghetto and was hidden from the Nazis. When they could no longer keep him in their living quarters, Zalman, his father, prepared a barrel, which he sunk in the ground outside his quarters, and using the tubes of a stethoscope, remember, he was a doctor, he funneled air into the barrel. He kept the boy there. When he realized this could not continue, as I was adept at getting things in and out of the ghettos, Yankel Levine recalled, Zalman asked me if I could smuggle this child out of the ghetto into the hands of our friend. I bided my time until a Nazi officer raiding one of the ghetto apartments saw a credenza he wanted and asked me to deliver it to his quarters outside of the ghetto. I took the child, placed him in the door of the credenza, directed my wagon towards the gate of the ghetto. And the child survived outside of the Kovno ghetto, and eventually, as you've heard, was reunited with Zalman Grinberg. The story doesn't have a happy ending, though, because eventually this child would die after the war and did not survive, became ill and survived several years after the war. And Klausner writes about this, although Grinberg would have other children afterwards. After August of 1945, Klausner himself was no longer formally or even informally attached to a military unit. And as he noted, he felt himself now no more than a DP, as he described himself. I had no assigned military connection, and I had to devise ways of supporting myself. Indeed, it seems that at this time, Klausner came to identify himself with the survivors and their plight. In the first issue of Unser Weg, Our Way, the Yiddish weekly sponsored by the Central Committee, Klausner penned an article titled, quote, One of You, in which he described the intimate connection he had established with the surviving population. I'm going to skip ahead. I know you well, my people. I know your thoughts and I hear your speech. I know your dreams and I behold your works, and I am thankful for destiny for weaving me into the pattern of your rebirth. Have I written as one who has suffered with you? I have done it only because I have hoped during these months that if not through suffering, then through my work, you would accept me as one of you. And in response, the editorial board wrote back regarding Klausner's special status as an honorary member of the surviving remnant, Rabbi, friend, brother, you have become one of us. Others shared this view that not enough was being done to aid the Jewish DPs and saw Klausner as a true champion of the survivors. Rabbi Eli Bonin, the first chaplain to reach Dachau after the war, described Klausner as, quote, the one bright gleam of hope in the whole mess. The agencies have done practically nothing, and he has by himself moved mountains. If he had the resources of the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, at his disposal, he would have performed super miracles. As it is, he only performed miracles. Klausner would dedicate the fourth volume of Hapletah to Zalman Grinberg, in which he wrote, and the Lord chose him from among his sorrowing children and said unto him, forget thy sorrow and burden thyself with the afflictions of my children. Wipe the tears from off their cheeks, heal their wounds, and kindle their hearts with hope. And so it was. And indeed, the failure of the Joint Distribution Committee to organize relief until the September of 1945, and I've written about this elsewhere, it took them 3 months to get approval from the US military to enter the zone of occupation. So while the survivors themselves thought, where's Joint? Where's our uncle from America coming to help us? They were tied up in American bureaucratic obstacles that prevented their arrival into the zone. But that's a whole other story. But the perceived failure of the JDC to organize relief until September of 45 would also be a source of bitterness for Klausner, as evidenced in a letter writing campaign that he organized. His letters, and Atina has written about this too in her book, urged American Jews to supplement the inadequate aid of the Joint and UNRWA, warning that, quote, immediate help must come from you if these newly liberated victims of Nazis are to survive the coming winter. And Klausner and Grinberg continued to work together to raise awareness of the DP's plight, as Harrison's report helped improve conditions but did not solve the problem of statelessness. And they endured the first winter in the DP camps, even as increasing numbers of infiltrates, many of whom had survived the war in the Soviet Union, began to arrive in the DP camps with the Bricha from Poland. Klausner would produce a film called These Are the People, which included extended excerpts of the January 27th, 1946 conference of the Central Committee of Liberated Jews, which was held in the Munich City Hall. I'm going to share a link to that. I'm not going to play it right now because I don't want to have technical difficulties leaving, but I'll share a link, and in the Q&A we can try. There is a copy of this film available through the USHMM, the Holocaust Museum Archives. And if we have time afterwards, I'll play it. Otherwise, I'll just share with you. It's openly available, and you can watch this film that Klausner produced in January of 1946 that has episodes from this. I'll skip ahead. So just you can see here with this story of the JDC, as would be the case with most of the things that Klausner did in Germany, his efforts too were not without controversy, and Klausner ran afoul of the JDC in multiple points. There was a lot of friction in this relationship. You can see here in this picture, this is Leo Schwartz, and Leo Schwartz was the third U.S. zone director in the American zone. There was a lot of turnover. First, there was Eli Rock, and then Lavi Becker. And Klausner's abrasiveness and his habit of chastising the JDC for its slow and disorganized arrival in the DP camps eventually caught up with him. And by the summer of 1946, Leo Schwartz made it his mission to have what he deemed the troublesome Klausner removed from the American zone of occupation. And indeed, he found that the vocal independence of the survivors and complaints emanating from the zone complicated his aid efforts, and he seemed to have identified Klausner as the source of most of these problems. And here you can see Klausner was involved in a lot of different areas. You can see here, this is a picture of Klausner welcoming David Ben-Gurion in the fall of 1945 on his visit to the DP camps. Here he is welcomed by Major Irving Haymont, who was the director of the Landsberg DP camp. But Klausner wrote about how he sort of, and took a lot of credit for himself, Klausner, I'll just say. So he's interesting, as Natalia mentioned, as a historian, when you look at these sources, you have to read them very critically, because if you have one person claiming a lot of credit, you have another person saying this person was the biggest pain in my you-know-what that I've ever encountered. The truth is probably somewhere in between, right? But Klausner is one of these figures who keeps popping up and inserted himself right into the middle of everything. I'm going to skip ahead. Oh, this is from the January 46 conference that I mentioned. And what's interesting is you can see here, so here's Zalman Grinberg speaking at this conference, and here's David Ben-Gurion, who in the video you also speaking at the same conference. I'm going to skip some of these images in the interest of time. So to close the circle on the relationship between Klausner and the JDC, Leo Schwartz, as I've mentioned, found him to be incredibly difficult, and not surprisingly, Klausner's dismissal coincided with what was a continuing dispute between the Central Committee of Liberated Jews and the Joint Distribution Committee over the independence, the aforementioned independence of the surviving population. In a letter to Edward Warburg, director of the JDC in New York, Zalman Grinberg asserted his view of the Central Committee as, quote, an agency representing the political and material needs of the people. And as he wrote to Warburg, the American Joint, if it so desires, can supply the budgetary needs of the Central Committee. We will not give it the right to determine whether or not we shall support a newspaper, purchase a clarinet, or manufacture taliesim, right? They wanted to have the Joint supply them with rations, but they wanted to have the independence to determine how they would be distributed. And I'm going to skip down, but Grinberg noted that it is our feeling that the directors of the American Joint look down upon us as DPs. The use of the term displaced person in this sense connotes an individual not only displaced in terms of home, but also in terms of vision and responsibility. Those Americans who have met our leadership or have examined their work will testify to the absurdity of this attitude. Now, Klausner, on the other hand, left Germany in July of 1946, having earned the tremendous appreciation of the DPs themselves and of those in the American military and Jewish organizations who recognized his remarkable sacrifice. Philip Bernstein, by then the advisor for Jewish affairs to the American Zone Commander, summarized Klausner's efforts in the years since liberation. Quote, "You took broken human beings and fragments of Jewish life and built them into a community. You gave these people dignity and purpose. Perhaps you have made history. Who knows how long this community will endure? So despite whatever problems arose, you have a right to take lifelong satisfaction from your achievements here." Now, Klausner had a 6-month hiatus in the United States between the summer of 1946 and the beginning of 1947. And in the course of this time, from when he left to when he returned to the American Zone, which is a whole other story, the nature of the surviving remnant, right? The nature of the Hapletah, which literally was listed in this, the names list books, was completely transformed. And it was transformed because you had large numbers of Jews who had survived the war elsewhere, traveling with the Bricha from Poland, using underground routes, crossing borders to reach the American Zone of Germany. So you had over 100,000 Jews, which completely transformed the nature of the surviving population. So, you know, and one way to think about the way in which the surviving population was transformed is to look at these demographic breakdowns of the surviving population. So the names lists that we have that look at the summer of 1945 till basically January of 1946 and have 60,000 people listed is one sort of snapshot of the surviving population as it looked like after liberation from the concentration camps in particular. But as you can see, over the course of 1946 and into 1947, the population grows, and more people had not survived in concentration camps, but had survived either in the far reaches of the Soviet Union or in hiding, or as some of the examples in Natalia referenced. And you have more young people coming in, and you have more babies coming in, and you have new families that are being formed at this time. So the nature of what we refer to as the Hapletah, as the surviving remnant, is also transformed. I'm gonna wrap up, Liz, so we have some time for Q&A, and make sure that we address questions that people might have, because I've covered a lot of different topics. I'll just note that in the course of the time after Klausner went to America and then came back in the summer of 1947, he began to be very concerned about what he referred to as the demoralization of the surviving population, right? He was very worried that prolonged waiting of the surviving population in the DP camps would lead to complete demoralization. And what he had identified with the early leaders of the Hapletah, this idea of a Zionist enthusiasm that everybody should make Aliyah and go to the land of Israel, was beginning to wane as people were willing to consider immigration to wherever they could go after the war. And he began to advocate what we can only refer to as radical solutions to the problem of Jewish DP displacement. They need to be, he noted, not asked, but told what to do. He wrote, the people, quote, must be forced to go to Palestine. And this coincided with the timing of a ramped up effort to break the British blockade, to put people on ships, largely, you know, these ships that were ships of Holocaust survivors trying to break the British blockade, what we refer to as the Hapletah, the immigration movement to break the British blockade. And the most famous of these is, of course, the story of the Exodus, 1947, the ship that is intercepted in July of 1947, and the survivors on the boat are put onto a floating prison ship and brought back to Germany. But I'll skip for now. I always put too many images in my PowerPoints anyway, so there's so much good material. Okay, so just a little note about Klausner and sort of his experience with the surviving population. His status as an honorary DP, as he is referred to, made him uniquely capable of identifying with Jewish survivors. They trusted him to represent them before the US Army, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation, the Jewish Agency, the World Jewish Congress, and the JDC, among others. At the same time, Klausner was comfortable criticizing the DP community when he felt it was necessary. And in his introduction to Klausner's memoirs, Yehuda Bauer suggests that Klausner's actions from 1945 to 48 evoked, quote, the best prophetic tradition of our people. And again, this evokes this idea of the name Sheri Hapletah, the surviving remnant. You know how to heal and caress and support the weak and the sick, Bauer wrote, and how fearlessly to oppose the mighty, the rich, and the sated. You raised your voice to offer hope and a vision, and you raised in a bitter controversy with those who considered to be heartless bureaucrats. You may have been occasionally wrong in your judgments, but I don't think you were ever wrong in your actions for the survivors, unquote. And I'll just note that after the establishment of the State of Israel, Klausner left the military and began recruiting pilots and nurses in the United States for what would become the Israel Defense Forces. Ben-Gurion offered for him to work in Israel. He eventually became provost of Hebrew Union College, and then he served as senior rabbi at Temple Israel in Boston from 1949 to 1953, and eventually was a rabbi in Yonkers for many years until his retirement in 1989, where he moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And he died at the age of 92 in 2007. Zalman Grinberg is a whole other fascinating story. He ends up moving to Petah Tikva, and then for health reasons has to move to the United States and ends up settling in Long Island. And actually one of his sons lives here in Connecticut. It's a whole other fascinating story about what happened to people after the war. And I'll just say that sort of these efforts, like these attempts to create these names lists, Atina and I were at a conference about 2 years ago at Santa Tilian, which tried to bring together the babies that were born at this hospital that Zalman Grinberg had helped organize. You still see these efforts of attempts to take the lists that are created at that time to bring people together, to find families that had been separated by continents, literally. Some people end up in Australia, some people end up in South Africa, some people end up in Israel, some people end up in America. And so these sources we can talk about are incredibly valuable still to this day to bring people together. I'll conclude there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Avi. That was really fascinating. I loved hearing about the complicated and evolving challenges faced by the survivors and the actions of Klausner and Grinberg. Thank you so much. Okay, let me start taking a look at the questions coming in. So folks would like a copy of the address of Zalman Grinberg on May 27th and his definition of a DP. So we'll get that link to you. The chat box is open. Okay, there's a question about whether Yiddish was the language of communication and how well did Klausner know Yiddish?
Okay, so really good question. I'm gonna, sorry, I put the link in there, but we can also share it separately. And of course, there's things that I won't be able to address right now. You can always contact me and I'm happy to share materials as well. But this has the video of that meeting from January of 1946. So that's a really good question that I've tried to figure out. Sort of clearly there's a sense like he spoke our language, literally and figuratively. I don't know how great his Yiddish was. I just, it's I've wondered this myself, right? I know he knew German, and I knew that, I think that he was able to communicate with everybody, and Yiddish was the lingua franca, for lack of a better term, at the time in the DP camps. So although, as you'll see, it's really interesting. So one of the things that strikes me, you're going to see in this video, when you see Zalman Grinberg talking. So the video, Abe Klausner starts and he addresses his audience in English because of course he's addressing an American audience and he's doing this for fundraising purposes. And he says, these are the people and they need your help and they need your support. And then Zalman Grinberg gives his address, and his address he gives in German. So it's just really interesting to think about who the audience is and might be. And this is something we can talk about when we talk about Langes der Weg. Again, questions of who, the movie that we're going to watch later, who was the intended audience for this. But yeah, Klausner, just long answer, yes, he could communicate with them in Yiddish.
Thank you. There are other questions from the teachers. Okay, I have a longer question. Actually, Atina Grossman is joining us. Atina, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question instead of me reading a long question. Thank you. One moment, please. Okay, Atina, are you able to unmute yourself?
I think I am unmuted. Hi, Avi. Can you hear me?
Hi, Atina. I hear you.
Okay. Well, this is, you will not be surprised by this question. But I was just wondering, but because it's something that hasn't shown up in my own reading of this material, whether Klausner and others ever linked this issue of the demoralization of the second group of survivors to specific experiences that they'd had in the Soviet Union, to their having been behind the lines in the unoccupied Soviet Union, and the ways in which they had managed to survive there, such as black market, et cetera, rather than just focusing on this question of the prolonged waiting and the living as displaced persons. I mean, because I haven't seen it explicitly discussed, and I'm just wondering whether you've come across such references.
Right. Great. Thank you. So it's as I sort of briefly mentioned, rushing at the end, there's these reports that Klausner starts writing in 1947, just for context, in 47 and then into 48, where he is really concerned about the morale of the surviving population, the morale of the DPs that he sees in the American zone. So the question of whether this is linked to their experience of survival in the far reaches of the Soviet Union, I do not recall that being addressed specifically in these reports. However, reading between the lines, there is a lot of language in there about the sort of, let's think about this sort of question of morale and morality, right? And there's questions about, well, how did people survive? What did they have to do in order to survive? And there is one of the things that's fascinating about Klausner is that he develops this extremely close relationship with the first cohort, let's call it, of the surviving population, which, he uses the term Hapletah to identify the surviving remnant, which are largely people that survived and liberated from the concentration camps. And there seems to be a distinction that's drawn between people who survived in that way and people who survived, what did you have to do in order to survive by fleeing to the east and surviving in the far reaches of the Soviet Union? And this is a different population. And let's face it, like those distinctions, as you've written about, have endured until the present day, right? And even though I talked about this term Hapletah as a surviving remnant, as a collective identity for all the survivors, what's more accurate is that in the aftermath, what we call survivors, or Leben gebliebene, people who are, remained alive, were more likely to be identified either by place of origin. So you see a lot of groups that begin to get organized. Where are you from? Kind of what we think about in sort of a Landsmannschaften sense, right? Where are you from before the war? Or what were your wartime experiences? So for example, the leaders, one of the leading groups in the DP camps are people who are identified either as people who had been partisans, right? And they assume a position of leadership, or the ghetto fighters are sort of unquestioned, people who of leadership and sort of idolized in the DP camps. And it's interesting, a lot of the early leaders like Zalman Grinberg are physicians, which I think also, we can think about what are the needs of the surviving population, who's more likely to survive. The Lithuanian ghettos that are among the last, like Kovno, to be liquidated, and then they're transferred all the way to these labor camps, sort of determining who is likely to survive. But these are people who, for various reasons, and I think more research needs to be done into this, like what it is about their profile that makes them the leaders of the surviving population. Be that as it may, when Klausner comes back in the spring of 47, he is kind of like looking around him and he's like, this is a different population, right? What's going on? And he's trying to explain it. And I don't know, Atina, if he put two and two together and sort of said, oh, well, it's because of their different wartime experiences, but he clearly like noticed something, and he thought it was about demoralization from unemployment and demoralization from frustration over waiting 2 years and where are we going to go, and people getting immersed in black market activity, and maybe they're going to get stuck in Germany and they're never going to leave. And he's like, we have to get them out of here. We have to force them. And only the land of Israel is the only place they can go.
Thank you, Avi. There's a question about whether the same kinds of records are at the Bergen-Belsen DP camp are available, since it was in the British sector.
Atina, since you're here, do you know if you go to Bad Arolsen, are there records that are available there? Oh, she's muted.
Sorry, Atina, sorry.
Yes, but actually, Natalia, do you know? Sorry, this is like the family reunion of the scholars.
Right. So what I can say is, I just want to mention.
But the IPS has a lot, obviously.
Yeah, so I just want to mention, like this, referring to the sort of digitized records of the International Tracing Service,
right,
where there's a lot of material that's in the archive that's at Bad Arolsen. There's a lot of material has been digitized. Priorities given, so a lot of it for many years was just used for family displacement, relocation. There's a ton of material there. And I don't know as much about how it was then organized. Like, so for example, the Hapletah names list, the 60,000 or so names that I just talked about from the American zone, you can go to Jewish Gen, and go to and log in, and for a small contribution to support their efforts, check out the database. And also those, are available in libraries, like the USHMM library and other libraries. You can go in and see those. I don't know about the Bergen-Belsen
They
list.
are included. I mean, now things are becoming beautifully centralized. It's just heartbreaking that survivors didn't have a chance to peruse through all of these lists at the time. But Bad Arolsen is becoming open for searches. Like Avi said, it's no longer a question of proving your close family connection. And one material that is part of it, for example, that I didn't think about until recently, are the early applications for Wiedergutmachung for German well, I'm not even sure how to restitution money, but restitution also of property. But you end up finding there a lot of information about family, extended family network. So it's amazing what one can now find on Bad Arolsen website.
Yeah, I just thank you, Liz, for, I would just add that this sort of model of the list, the search list, was, for example, also, copied literally all over the world. In one place that you see it very clearly is, for example, is in the Aufbau, which was this transnational newspaper that was founded actually during the war by, actually even before the war, by German Jews, that was headquartered in New York. But as soon as the war ended, and as soon as lists of survivors were being produced, the Aufbau was publishing them, and as well as many, many ads. And in Germany as well, the Der Weg, which was the paper of the German Jewish, this very, very tiny, even tinier, much more a fragment of German Jews who survived, was publishing lists and also many, many ads from, I mean, sort of the same basic model of people from all over the world searching for survivors within Germany, and those who were in Germany announcing the fact that they were still alive. So it's a concept that is really used very generally.
I see that this conversation really is just beginning, and it's such an incredible gift to have the three of you here conversing. However, it is our lunch hour, and I have to be respectful of people's needs. So there are a couple more questions. Avi will be with us again later after the break. So perhaps I'll email you the questions in the interim, Avi, and that way, if there's a good place for you to address them later, then perhaps you can find that time. Sure. I know that I'd like to, first of all, thank all of our scholars, and in particular, Avi Patt, for his presentation just now. And we are going to break for lunch, and during lunch, we're going to open the chat box and unmute everyone so that you can just converse with each other unless you have other plans. I'm going to step off the Zoom meeting for a few minutes, and Paul Rudensky will stay. And Paul, may I turn it over to you for a moment?
Sure. Thank you, Liz. So, so again, I wanted to share my thanks to Avi for really great and moving presentation, and thank you, Liz, for for handling the questions.